Side quests. They're in every video game these days. If you don't know what I'm talking about, when you play a video game, there's always the main quest, the thing you're actually supposed to be doing, the reason you bought the game to begin with. And then there's everything else. Help Bo Peep find her lost sheep. Find all 900 Korok seeds in Hyrule. Spend 20 hours decorating a house you'll barely visit. They can be fun. They're actually the best part of some games. But every hour you sink into a side quest is an hour you're not spending on the thing you set out to do. How about in life, though? When you have a giant goal in front of you, if you're honest with yourself, how much of your time are you actually spending on it? This isn't a new problem. Confucius saw his own students wandering off on side quests, farming, medicine, music, astronomy, board games. Some of it was noble, some of it was just a nice way to pass an afternoon. And he told them if they really wanted to accomplish what they came to him for in the first place, they'd better be careful. But in typical fashion for the Analects, we've got just 8 syllables explaining this point. So for the next 2,000 years, nobody could agree on exactly what he meant. Was he telling us to keep our eyes on the prize? Or was he telling his followers to hunt down ideas they didn't like and stamp them out? Exploring the Analects, Episode 22. Passage 2.16. The Side Quest Trap. Hey folks, this is Elliot Bernstein. Thanks for joining me for Episode 22 of Exploring the Analects. In this episode, we'll be covering an 8-character phrase from the Analects about reaching your goals and getting distracted along the way. As always, I'll read the passage in Chinese and English, explain the ideas behind it and provide some historical context, and then analyze the language found in the passage as a way to learn new words and phrases in classical Chinese and modern Mandarin. If this is your first time listening, be sure to subscribe and drop me a hello in the comments. Let's kick things right off. Here's the passage in a modern Mandarin pronunciation, followed by my translation into English. 子曰,攻乎异端,斯害也已. Laboring along the byways. This is harmful indeed. The shortest path between 2 points is a straight line, and anyone who has a goal, one that they're serious about achieving, wants every step to be along that line. But in reality, that's rarely how we make progress toward our goals. When you're on a journey, it's a little more like this. You know the direction you came from. You think you're probably on the right path, but you're not sure when you'll reach your destination. You're not even too sure exactly what your destination looks like, so maybe you won't recognize it when you do get there. Sometimes you come to a fork in the road. No signs at all. As far as you're concerned, either way could just as easily lead you toward your destination. What are the consequences of taking the wrong path? If you're on a months-long journey, do you lose days once you realize you need to backtrack? If you don't realize you need to backtrack, do you end up somewhere that looks like the right destination, but actually isn't anywhere close to where you were supposed to go to begin with? I understand passage 2.16 to be about making progress toward a major life goal. So these are the kinds of questions and concerns it raises. I'm talking about goals that take years, decades, possibly an entire lifetime to achieve. If you spend years unaware that you're on a detour, if you never make it back onto the path toward the goal that meant so much to you, that might be the entire difference between success and failure. Those detours and the paths you see branching off as you travel are the byways of Passage 2.16. These roads are all dusty and uneven, so trudging along any of them, whether it's the right one or the wrong one, is serious labor. You'll be exhausted at the end of the day, just hoping to find a hedge or outcropping to sleep behind. When you head down the wrong path, there's no telling how much extra effort it's going to take to get back on track. But you do know one thing. The setback is significant. You can continue on and hold out hope that this one meets back up with the right road, or you can double back to where you took the wrong turn. Either way, as the passage says, this is harmful indeed. I've been talking generally about making progress toward your goals, and I think the points apply regardless of what your goals are. But when these words were written 2,500 years ago, the goal was a very specific one. Confucius wasn't a self-help guru advising people to follow their dreams, whatever those may be. He wanted the rulers he advised and the disciples he taught to become junzi, exemplary people whose behavior and interactions with others promoted a flourishing and harmonious society. And the way he saw it, there was one path that would lead you toward becoming an exemplary person, and then there were all others. The path to becoming a junzi is a core element of the Confucian way of the Analects. Confucius believed that ancient sage kings, semi-mythical figures like Yao, Shun, and Yu, passed down practices and customs with the power to prevent people from becoming greedy, narrow-minded, and self-interested, and allow them to develop respect, compassion, and a sense of justice. While he was not under the illusion that the whole world could deeply develop these qualities, he still saw it as an imperative to addressing the challenges of his time that rulers and ministers behave like junzi in everything they do. If you're curious to hear more about the ways of the ancient sage kings, or how a junzi might act, I recommend you check out episodes 13 and 15 of this series. Now that we're clear on the implied goal in this passage, keep it in mind while we move on to discuss everything that's not the goal. This is actually the more important part, because the focus of this passage isn't the goal itself. It's the alternatives and the distractions. Those are the byways. They branch off, sometimes running parallel to the main path, but they might just head off in a completely different direction. It's not necessarily clear that they're the wrong way either. Maybe one of these paths is shaded and well-paved, looking very inviting, and another leads off in a direction where, far in the distance, you see a magnificent city. To put this in practical terms, say you're a high school student at the top of your class with your heart set on attending Harvard. Alternatives might actually still tempt you. You could attend a small liberal arts college where it would be easier to stay at the top of your class. Or you could say that you're done with formal education and ready to try your hand at building a startup. It's not that these things are wrong, per se. They're just not compatible with your original goal, so they lead you away from it. The alternatives to staying on the main path are what commentators refer to as xiao dao, the small ways, and taji, other skills. Just from the names, you can probably see how they still align with the school example. Attending a liberal arts college could be considered staying on a smaller path than an Ivy League like Harvard, and by building a startup, you'll develop other skills than you would while studying for your bachelor's. In terms of the world of the Analects, by which I mean the world where the main path and your goal as a student of Confucius would be to cultivate virtues and become an exemplary person, the small ways and other skills were a bit different. Small ways were most likely professions and practices Confucius considered tangential to being a government minister, and commentators have a rather long list of what these might have been. It includes farming, medicine, astronomy, and alchemy. Just like attending a liberal arts college, it's not that these are wrong in any particular way. They just take you down a path that leads away from the goal of becoming a government minister. The world needs farmers, doctors, even astronomers and alchemists, I suppose, because how else do you eventually invent physics and chemistry? But it was highly unlikely that a farmer or doctor would also have become a minister. Excelling in any of those fields would be an all-consuming proposition. So, unless you're someone blessed with exceedingly rare talent, you choose one and get good at it, or else you kind of end up sucking at all of them. Now, you might have noticed a bit of a contradiction. These are the small ways, but I'm also saying there's nothing wrong with them and the world needs them. And if there is the Da Dao, or the Great Way, and Confucius wanted his students to become ministers, we sure seem to be saying that these small ways are of lesser value. This all has to do with what Confucius believed could bring the greatest benefit to the most people. Food and health were important, but without safety, you might not live long enough to worry about your health. And without peace, a farmer could try to grow crops, but what use would that be when his field was on fire? So building confidence in the state through good governance and principled ministers was a necessary precondition for ensuring an entire country's worth of people could turn to focus on their health and happiness. On top of caring deeply about good governance, Confucius had a sort of hierarchy of righteousness from the Junzi, exemplary person that we've already mentioned, moving on to the xianren, or the worthy, and finally to the exalted level of the shengren, the sage. What qualified someone as a worthy or a sage rather than just an exemplary person? It was all a matter of how many lives they could positively affect. Anyone could become an exemplary person just by always doing what was right for their family and friends. But that's probably a matter of affecting the lives of just a handful of people. A worthy's impact is amplified. Someone who improves conditions for hundreds or thousands of people, even people they'll never meet and have no relation to. We'll get to the sage another time, but take the worthy and amplify the impact again. The sage's impact should echo across generations and to lands unknown. Tying this all back to the Great Way, Confucius saw government service as the clearest path to amplification of impact. It's not that other paths had no chance of doing so. He was actually in awe of sages who built infrastructure, spread agricultural knowledge, studied medicine, and more. He even didn't get the chance himself to have a great impact through government service, and instead benefited the world through teaching. But for the most part, the beaten path from exemplary person to worthy would lead them to government service. Well, that's about it for the small ways or alternative paths. The other term I mentioned was taji, or other skills. Among the practices listed by commentators, I place divination, music, archery, board games, and gambling in this category. The commentators also mention extracting walnut oil. I've got to look into that one. Anyway, as opposed to farming or medicine, these are more like distractions. There's something attractive, even valuable, about many of them. In fact, by all accounts, Confucius was a highly talented musician himself who saw music as a core element of a harmonious society. And archery was also an art that he and his students put time and effort into practicing. The point was not that these had no value. It was that they couldn't be the main focus for anyone who wanted to travel the Great Way. It might make sense to return to our example of building a startup instead of going to Harvard. If you spend all of your time after high school coding and building software, there's going to be a trade-off. You might build something truly exceptional. It might be worth hundreds of millions or billions of dollars, but you've spent time with that computer, estimating time complexity and deciding on system architectures, instead of with other people in a classroom. Now, today, we have more tools than ever to lessen the impact of these trade-offs. You could get an entire world-class undergraduate education absolutely for free with what's available on MIT OpenCourseWare. But it still takes a highly exceptional individual to be able to tread both the path of these other skills at the same time as following the Great Way. One historical note, just for fun, and maybe a little consolation for anyone out there who's listening and happens to be a professional musician. Maybe you're feeling a little unfairly judged right now. Well, as a practical concern, Confucius probably didn't think it would have been appropriate for the vast majority of his students to become career musicians because they weren't blind. During the Zhou dynasty, professional musicianship, especially those who served as court musicians, was an occupation reserved for the vision impaired and the blind. He had nothing but the highest regard for musicians and the power of music, and he believed that the quality of music not only reflected the health of a culture and a state, but also was one of the most important practices for cultivating virtue, building a community, and harmonizing a society. So, there you have it. That's my interpretation of passage 2.16. When you're working toward a big goal, one that might take years or decades to accomplish, you should frequently ask yourself if the shiny object in the distance or that inviting path in front of you is also along the way, or if it might be a major detour. And if you happen to be a student of Confucius, stop wasting your time trying to perfect the art of extracting walnut oil. Now I'm going to dig into some of the alternative readings of this passage, starting off by mentioning that the standard reading of this passage since at very least 800 years ago was nothing like what we've presented above. All interpretations circle around how to properly learn and how to build one's knowledge of the ways of the world, but from there, they begin to diverge. Now, both the passage preceding and the passage following 2.16 in the Analects shared this focus. We're told that learning without thinking leads to confusion, and thinking without learning leads to trouble. And famously, we learn that wisdom is to recognize what you know as what you know, and to recognize what you do not know as what you do not know. So it's a fair bet that the compilers of the Analects felt this was a statement about knowledge and learning as well. But there's far too much ambiguity around the core terms of 2.16 to be clear on its meaning without additional context. And that starts with the very first character, gong. What I rendered as laboring, and what other translators who agree with me render something like to dedicate effort. But the other occurrences of gong in the Analects actually mean to strike, as in to physically hit or attack in battle. So many traditional commentators took it this way. Now next, there's yi duan, which I rendered as the byways. Yi means different or alternative, and duan means a terminal point, an endpoint, or an extreme. So putting this all together, you get to attack alternative endpoints. What the heck does that even mean? Well, for the first few hundred years after Confucius's life, people seem to have been more or less on the same page with my reading. But starting around 500 CE, during the Six Dynasties period, gong was read as attacking, and these so-called alternative ends took on the meaning of heterodoxy or perverse doctrines. I suppose you could think of it like the great way that Confucius urged his students to follow is the balanced path, never too far to any one extreme. But if you veer all the way to one side or the other, eventually you'll go off course and find yourself under the spell of one of these perverse doctrines. By the time of Zhu Xi in the 12th century, this was the common reading. Zhu took gong to mean more along the lines of dedicating effort or studying, but wrote that the perverse doctrines Confucius was referring to were philosophies like Moism and Yangzhuism. Despite his greatness in many other areas, Zhu Xi likely made an incorrect assumption here. Only the seeds of these philosophies existed in Confucius's time, and while he may have had other teachings in mind, it seems unlikely that he would have taken such a strong stand against them only once in the entire Analects. As the influence of Buddhism and Taoism grew in China, the perverse doctrines reading became even more relevant and politically expedient. By the Ming dynasty, one additional ambiguity in the passage's terms transformed its meaning even further. This is the character yi. Normally, this yi is a tone marker, and in my translation, it's rendered as indeed. But it can be taken to mean stop. So if we read it that way, we can turn the passage into an instruction, and that is, strike out against perverse doctrines, and their harm will stop. So whether it is the philosophies of Mozi and Yangzhu, or those of the Buddha and the Taoist masters, or even if it's just not the state-sanctioned interpretation of the Confucian classics, the official class of the Ming and Qing dynasties were authorized to strike out and stop the harm of these ideas. Well, that's not a terribly tolerant take, and it's a little ironic considering that passage 2.14, just 2 passages above, tells us that the exemplary person is inclusive, not partisan, and that petty people are partisan, not inclusive. If you're not already convinced that striking out at perverse doctrines is probably a misreading of this passage, there's one more piece of evidence worth considering. In 1973, a copy of the Analects was discovered that had been sealed in a cave since the 1st century BCE. This version, known as the Dingzhou Analects, showed a number of differences from the version we read today. Among them was that very character from earlier, gong. Instead of the character for attack is another character, gong, meaning to work or achieve. So while we still can't be totally sure what these different endpoints are referring to, it seems pretty likely that we're not supposed to be attacking them. Alright, so if that wasn't enough philology noodling for you, we're finally at the vocabulary section. A lot of this isn't going to be much of a surprise if you've been paying attention, but I'll still step through the characters one by one, as well as cover the overall grammatical structure so that at least you're not left wondering about any single piece, even if you still don't know what it actually means as a whole. Here goes. Gong, like we just said, literally means to attack. But considering the Dingzhou manuscript, as well as the fact that scribal errors and homophone substitutions occurred frequently in ancient texts like these, you can read this as the other gong, to work or succeed. I translated it as laboring. Hu is a classical conjunction very similar to yu, though it has a tonal function if it falls at the end of a sentence. Here, a very straightforward translation would be on, to, or from. In order to strengthen the path analogy and give a sense of movement, I chose along. Yi means alternative or different. It still has this meaning in modern Mandarin, such as in the words yi xing, opposite sex, and bian yi, to mutate. Duan is an end or an extreme. This also still has such a meaning in modern Mandarin, like in the word ji duan zhu yi, extremism. It's worth noting that duan is not necessarily the final part of something, just one end point, which is reflected in the modern Mandarin kai duan, a beginning. Some people, like one of my favorite translators, Edward Slingerland, even read this passage as meaning working from the wrong starting points. But I could only cover so many interpretations in one episode, so we won't go down that path. Given the literal meaning of yi duan, different endpoints might give you a sense of why my translation is a little more artistic and a little less technical. I rendered these characters as the byways, and I wouldn't fault anyone for taking issue with that. But the way I see it, if you work toward different endpoints than someone else, you're effectively on a separate path, and different implies an abnormal one. So to say this is a byway, a secondary route, seems like a bit less of a stretch. All right, we're halfway there. Si is a lot like the other classical demonstrative qi. It just doesn't strictly demand a referent. In this case, it has one, which is the first four characters. So si indicates that the second half of this passage is a comment on the first. The comment is as follows. Hai ye. It is harmful. Hai means to harm, and it does in modern Mandarin today. And ye is the standard way in classical Chinese of indicating a phrase is one of definition, statement of fact, or providing commentary. Finally, there's that annoying little character, yi. We covered above that it's unlikely to mean stop. It's actually used throughout the Analects in combination with its preceding character, yi, to add emphasis and finality to a statement. I rendered it as indeed, and elsewhere you'll find it rendered as truly, nothing but, and so forth. All right, folks, that's it for this one. Don't forget to follow, like, and comment on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere you happen to be listening or watching. Visit analects.net for the entire episode guide, or drop me a line at elliot@analects.net. And join me next time when we'll be reading passage 4.4 of the Analects to learn how to rid our hearts of evil and revisit the core Confucian value of ren, or human-heartedness. See you there.